In 2002, an innovative new company launched with a singular mission: to enable people to live on other planets. And this company was faced with pretty significant competitive pressure from the incumbents. And they needed to find a way to build reusable rockets so that they could compete with these companies that have been around a lot longer than them. Taking these constraints, SpaceX was able to deliver reusable rocket technology by something that was deemed impossible by many in the industry before this. Over the next 2 decades, SpaceX embraced these constraints of reusability, and this helped them to deliver their first recovery of a rocket, Falcon 9, in 2015. And by 2017, they made history by successfully relaunching a rocket back into space that had been previously retrieved. But this focus on constraints wasn't only a development for SpaceX, it also changed space travel as we know it. The cost of launching a rocket is 10 times cheaper than it was 10 years ago because of the work that SpaceX has been doing. So by focusing on the constraints of reusability and cost effectiveness, SpaceX was able to drive massive innovation for themselves and also in the industry. So why am I talking about rockets when we're at a data conference? Well, the focus on thinking inside the box in this story really helps us to understand how focusing on constraints can drive innovation and make the impossible possible. And that's what I want to talk about today. How can data teams think about squeezing maximum ROI out of small data by focusing our efforts and making constraints play in our favor? But constraints are not something we typically talk a lot about in especially the modern data stack. We often think really big. When we talk about constraints, we're often focused on the lack of them. With massively scalable cloud data warehouses, we can spin up new databases and scale infrastructure in minutes, regardless of what our actual data size or needs are. We have the ability to sync more and more data with all the different connectors that we have options for, and we can add more data models to our dbt projects. We can deliver more and more dashboards to the business, seemingly with less effort and faster than we've ever been able to do it before. But if we stop and wonder, where did this abundance mindset come from? How did we get here? Well, if we look back to the time when the modern data stack kind of had its glow-up period and when it started to develop, we were in a bit of an atypical economic condition where we had a bull market and massive economic growth for just over 10 years. Paired with this was the zero interest rate period that we've been talking so much about. This is over now, but when the modern data stack was growing up, it was very easy to borrow money and build companies, which these conditions are what allowed us to go from this in 2012 to this in 2024. And as data people, we now have literally endless options to buy our data infrastructure and expand our capabilities. But is this really a good thing? This level of competitiveness and abundance mindset is what also gets us here. With thousands of data models that all need to be maintained for data quality, documentation written about them, and even more. And on the delivery side of things, we end up with more BI dashboards than the business knows how to handle, and half the time no one's looking at any of them. So to maximize our ROI, we need to find a way to challenge this abundance mindset that the modern data stack has thrust upon us. We need to go back to first principles and think about the value that we deliver divided by the cost that it takes for us to run our data teams. So let's focus on this first piece. To maximize value, we have to focus. We can't be deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. But this can be really hard for data teams. And this is partially because for decades now, the business has been telling us how sexy we are. First, it was the data scientist, and then analytics engineers took that title. And most recently, data engineers have been titled the sexiest of the 21st century. So companies who want to become data-driven have jumped at the chance to hire their first data team, the first data person, who's going to create magic from that data in their business. And so we've become pretty accustomed to being in demand. And if you work on a data team, you know what this feels like. A long lineup of stakeholders, all of which are vying for our time. There's more requests than ever before, and there's not enough time to get it all done. Every data team that I've ever worked on has felt chronically under-resourced. But I think what we need to realize is that not all stakeholder requests and not all stakeholders are created equal. One tool that we can use to think about this is the stakeholder engagement matrix. Thinking about stakeholders rather than the requests that they submit. Thinking about the people in the business who are the most powerful, and focusing our time on those individuals. The worst place to get caught as a data team is in this bottom right-hand corner, the keep informed quadrant. These are the people who are very hungry for data. They're typically focused on tactical execution in the business. And the work that these people can submit to your backlog will keep you busy for years on end. The people that are really going to make a difference in the business are the ones in the top quadrant. And oftentimes, we may need to spend our time engaging them from the keep satisfied and move them into the engage and consult quadrant by increasing their interest in data. So how do we do that? Well, we have to speak their language. We have to understand the business. And to fundamentally understand the business, we can't be talking about pipelines and orchestration and warehouse partitioning when we talk to these people. This will not get their buy-in. We have to understand the business at least as well as they do, if not better. One of the ways that we can do this is by thinking about the business as a growth model. How does the business make money? I work for a company called Hive. We are a secondary marketplace for pre-IPO stock trading. This is a metrics tree that would apply to the business that I work in. So being able to take this type of a tool and start speaking to the leaders in the business changes the conversation from data to how does this business actually function and how can we measure performance. This isn't just a documentation asset. This can be translated into weekly metrics reviews, forecasting projects, and things where you can actually show the business, if we pull these levers, here's how we generate more revenue for our business. And when we start talking like this, we start getting more visibility with those senior stakeholders and moving them into that engage and consult quadrant. So maybe you have a stakeholder who is actually in the engage and consult quadrant, but they're asking you to implement a generative AI model to do something extremely simple that it doesn't require. Maybe you've got a CEO that's talking a little bit like this. They want to use AI for everything. This can also become a great opportunity to educate these stakeholders and start to talk about the value that you can deliver from first principles, and also start to focus on the constraints that you have in your business. So let's talk about that next. So focusing on the constraints, as we saw for SpaceX, actually helps to drive more innovation. And as I said earlier, I think the modern data stack has this challenge that we try to minimize the constraints. We try to talk about the fact that we don't have any constraints. Quick poll, how many folks do we have in the room who are trained engineers? I'm curious. Okay, it's about 50, a little less than 50%. Okay, so that validates my hypothesis that a lot of data folks, and especially folks who have been in the industry a little longer or maybe are coming from different backgrounds, we haven't been formally trained necessarily in the idea of focusing on constraints and how those affect the quality of our project. So the iron triangle is a really great tool to use when you're thinking about planning your projects out in data. This is an important conversation to have with the business, that delivery of a high quality project, you're always going to be focusing on scope, cost, and time. And a lot of times the business wants us to move extremely fast and deliver a high quality project without regard for the long-term cost and the scope creep of a project. If we start to bring these into our conversations of data project planning and bringing this into a formal engineering design process, we can then start to think about constraints and keep them in mind as we build out our projects. When we think about cost, though, we don't only want to think about the cost of delivering a project in that moment. We need to also think about the cost, the hidden costs, which is thinking about the total cost of ownership. So the initial purchase price of a new tool or building a new model or your compute costs is one thing. But we also need to think about the ongoing maintenance of projects, the downtime, the scaling costs, things that aren't necessarily easy to identify when you're first planning a project. The other thing to consider is that sometimes we build in tools that may all of a sudden change their pricing models, and this can really shake things up for us. This is not unknown to a lot of data teams, where you've become dependent on something, and then it becomes a lot more expensive overnight. And so in this post-ZIRP economy, we as data teams need to be careful how we're building and thinking about what happens if something I become very dependent on changes on me overnight. So if you remember, there was a concept of a millennial tax that was talked about back in the early 2010s, where Uber, DoorDash, companies like that would start to think about, they would give you a discount on their service so that you would get hooked on using the app. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit in the modern data stack. There's this tax that a lot of times you can get hooked on using these products very early on with free credits and other things, incentives to get you bought in. And then pricing models or things like that change. So it's very important for us as data teams to think about the choices that we make now and how they will scale into the future. We're even seeing tools now that are helping us to reduce cost, so more tools that we can buy that will help us to reduce our cost. But these are actively helping us shrink our bills. These also become great assets that you can take back to the business to drive accountability. I don't know how many folks have created assets for stakeholders who don't have a concept or an understanding of the cost that it takes to maintain something. People don't have a concept for what it takes to build a dashboard or to maintain a pipeline, maybe if it doesn't get used very much. And so typically, stakeholders are so far removed from the cost of their requests that we need to make that more visible to them and start thinking about pushing that accountability back on the business. Tools that we are here celebrating today, DLT, Mother Duck, some more, these are ones that can help us to think about cost containment from the beginning. When we start to build from the ground up, we may be able to build with these constraints in mind and get ahead of these costs before they happen. So as we start to unravel this illusion that constraints don't exist, they've always been there, we've just been choosing to ignore them. And so with that, I will close things off and say, think about the two key levers of ROI. The value that we deliver and the cost that it incurs, that it takes for us to deliver this value. To maximize our value, we must resist this abundance mindset that we can just continue to build nonstop. And we have to think about focusing our efforts with certain stakeholders who are most important in the business. To minimize our costs, we can turn constraints into innovation. Focus on constraints and costs first, and treat them as first-class citizens at your planning table. If we treat them accordingly as an opportunity to innovate, we can build higher quality data products. All right, thanks for listening, and would love to connect. Thank you.